Okay, hello. This is a continuation of my summary of how the United States is starting a new Cold War with Russia. And today we're going to focus on Russia stealing Crimea, question mark. So Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 is arguably the key inciting incident that set off this new Cold War between the US and Russia. U.S. politicians and the U.S. media have portrayed this annexation as one, rapacious Russian aggression; two, a brutal violation of international norms; three, evidence that Russia is intent on conquering neighboring nations to the west to rebuild its glorious empire of old. But is this really true, or is it distorted, lying bullshit? So here's a little background. The USA supported the Euromaidan movement with $5 billion and strong diplomatic assistance for Ukraine's integration into the European Union and NATO, essentially joining the West, turning from the East, which is Russia, to the West. All right, NATO is key, and we were pushing this way back since 2008, actually, and before. And when the Euromaidan group conducted a revolution and seized power in 2014, the installation of a pro-West government increased risk of Ukraine joining NATO. Not only does Ukraine membership in NATO threaten Russian gas sales to Europe, it also threatens Russia with loss of all its military bases in Crimea. And Crimea is the most strategic point in the Black Sea, as I will show you in a little bit. Subsequently, Putin moved to restore Crimea to Russia. All right. Now, this was portrayed in the West as aggressive Russian expansionism and evidence of Russia's intention to conquer nations to the West to rebuild its glorious old empire. U.S. politicians and the U.S. media painted a picture of Russia as a dangerous and scary threat. But Crimea was an irredentia that rightfully belongs inside Russia in all ways. So historically, it belongs in Russia. Crimea has been part of Russia since 1783. All right? That's when Russia first took Crimea. Militarily, Russia has had a naval base in Crimea since 1772. Ethnically, there are over 4 times more Russians in Crimea than Ukrainians. Politically, Crimea has made multiple attempts to gain independence from Ukraine, all of which were squashed by Ukraine. Linguistically, Russian is by far the dominant language, with roughly 8 times more Crimean people speaking Russian than Ukrainian. Through 4 wars, Russia has spilled blood for Crimea. Right? They spilled blood in the Russo-Turkish War, Crimean War, World War I, World War II, all for Crimea. The popular will of the Crimean people, as expressed in 3 overwhelming votes in 3 separate referendums. So they want the independence. So way back in 1991, the 92.3% of the Crimean people voted for Crimean independence away from Ukraine. They wanted away from Ukraine. 1994, a referendum. There was a vote in which 78% of the people voted for increased Crimean autonomy. 83% voted for dual Russian and Ukrainian citizenship. So they want to inch towards Russia. And then 78% voted for independent Crimean laws. And I have a note here. Not obeying the nation's laws or having independent laws is de facto independence. Examples from U.S. history, from our history. In 1832, you had the South Carolina crisis, right, which the South Carolinas did not want to pay the tariff. That's a law. They all wanted to break the law, right? That almost led to the Civil War back in 1832. 30 years before the Civil War. It almost happened there. It was all about tariffs. The U.S. Civil War and the moral tariff. This was a driving force behind the Civil War. Not slavery, because there was no move by the North to end slavery. In fact, they protected and guaranteed it forever with the Corwin Amendment. Although the war started before it was ratified, but it was passed in both houses. The Texas Rebellion. Now, a lot of people think, historians say the Texas Rebellion began in 1835. Bullshit. It began on April 6, 1830, with Mexico's new laws, the April 6 laws, which the Texans did not obey. All right? And that resulted in a first conflict. I think the conflict was 1831. This was stage 2, the second part of it. Oh, that's taken as a start of the Texas Rebellion. It began here. And it's all about the laws. It is a crime for an individual to not obey laws, but if a whole people disobey the laws, that's sedition. That's rebellion. That's revolution. That's Declaration of Independence. Now, in 2014, 97% voted for Crimea to join Russia, with 83% voter turnout. And finally, to begin with, the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 was highly dubious for 5 reasons. 1, it was an expedient move to pacify or appease Ukraine in order to quell 8 years of anti-Soviet rebellion conflict between 1942 and 1950. Ukrainians are trying to break away. So it's like throwing them a bone. Hey, quit giving us trouble here. Take this. It was unconstitutional in that it was voted on by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, the representative body. The Presidium is only a small portion of, it's representative of a representative body, right? And not the full Supreme Soviet. As per their constitution, in order to have any boundary, border changes, it has to be voted on by the full Supreme Soviet. And on top of that, the vote in the Presidium was not legitimate because only 13 of 27 members of the Presidium were present. So there was no quorum. Thus, there was no legitimate vote. That's not even half. And many suspected Khrushchev's ties and sympathies with Ukraine. He was born there. He grew up there. He worked there. He married a Ukrainian woman. He was the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party, right? Before he became the head of the Soviet Communist Party. All right. And at that time, Crimea was part of Ukraine, and Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. So there was no tangible loss. All right? You transfer to Ukraine, who cares, because Ukraine's still part of the Soviet Union. But when Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union in 1991, it was expected that Boris Yeltsin would restore Crimea to Russia. However, he did not. The overwhelming weight of evidence shows that Crimea belongs to Russia. But U.S. politicians and the U.S. media never state any of the real evidence. Instead of portraying Russia's annexation of Crimea as a rightful restoration to where it belongs, the U.S. media and politicians portray it as a barbaric, expansionist theft of a completely foreign territory, which is bullshit, which by extension poses a threat to all the rest of Europe. If Russia's going to grab a foreign territory to the west, why not continue on? And the fear of perceived threat is fueling a Cold War. Fear-mongering always works. I swear, fear-mongering always works. Want to start a war? Just use fear-mongering for the people. But Russia was not trying to gain something. Russia was trying not to lose all its bases in Crimea, which is the most strategic point in the Black Sea. Russia already possessed those bases and stood to lose them all if Ukraine were to join NATO, whose raison d'etre is defense against Russia. So the whole purpose of NATO's existence is defend against Russia. And Russia is not expanding in Europe. Russia is contracting. Russia is being jacked backwards onto its heels. So this is during the Cold War. Here is the boundary of the Soviet Union. Pink here is the East Bloc states. So these are all part of the Soviet bloc, including Albania. Here's NATO. All right, on the fringes. Now, Soviet Union's broken up. All right, parts of the Soviet Union are now part of NATO. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Right, Poland, Czech, and Slovenia, Hungary. You know, all these. Romania, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, all these are now part of NATO. All right? So NATO's expanding on Russia. Russia's not expanding. Russia's being jammed back. Finally, once again, Russia was not initiating. Russia was reacting to the Euro-Maidan revolution and seizure of power, which increased the threat of NATO membership for Ukraine, jeopardizing all Russian military bases in Crimea. So, you may want to ask, well, why does Russia pack all its military bases in Crimea, all its Black Sea bases? Well, Crimea is strategically located to protect commerce, and commerce is a means of national strength, right? Because that's the means of military strength. Historically, Russia is a landlocked nation without maritime commerce, going way back. But ever since the rule of Peter the Great, he made this big start. You know, he ruled back in 1682 to 1725. Started this big push for the next 200 years in Russian foreign policy to gain access to maritime routes for both economic and geopolitical reasons. And these are the three routes that Russia has gained. The northern route through the Barents Sea, the Norwegian Sea, the Baltic Sea route, and the Black Sea route. So the Black Sea route is one of Russia's only three water access routes for water commerce, which is huge, right? Now, if you look at Crimea, that's Crimea right there. It's a peninsula that protrudes out into the Black Sea. It's centrally located. It's ideally located to guard access to the Black Sea, east-west shipping in the Black Sea, right? Now, as an analogy, you can liken it to Italy or Greece, both of which protrude out into the Black Sea. And Admiral Mahan said, Italy dominates the central Mediterranean and all shipping going east-west, right? He said Italy would dominate it if it were not for the fact that Britain held Malta. Malta's a tiny island right about here, all right? And so that's why Britain took Malta to negate Italy's dominance in the central Mediterranean. And in fact, that proved out to be historically relevant because during World War II, the North African campaign, of course, was fought in North Africa all along here, going back and forth east and west. However, the key element that won that campaign was nothing on the ground here, was no brilliant strategy by one side or the other. It was the fact that Britain held Malta, and it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier for planes based out of Malta, which destroyed all efforts to resupply those forces coming in from Italy or Greece. Plus, there's a naval base there to station British shipping to block all logistical resupply to the North African Corps, the German Desert Corps. All right, so there are many bases, military bases, packed into Crimea due to its obvious strategic location. Historically, this was recognized way back by everyone. The Greeks recognized it, the Romans. They all tried to take Crimea, or they took it. Byzantium, Ottoman Empire, Russia, UK, France, Germany. I mean, that's why they fought the Crimean War there. All right, so look at all the military bases. My eyesight's going. You can barely see here. Naval missile base. Naval base, air base, air base, air base. Black Sea Fleet. Coast Guard. Military base. Military base, air base. Marine base, air base. Air base. It's packed full of bases. Right? It's dense in bases. All right. So the strategic value of Crimea for Russia lies in its protection of Russian assets. One, its hydrocarbon pipelines. It's got 2 pipelines running from Russia to Turkey over here. It's got a Blue Stream pipeline running from Russia to Turkey over here. It protects the commerce, any commerce traveling through the Black Sea. And also for territorial defense. It stands as an outpost, blocking access to Russian territory here. So these strategic benefits would all be flipped were Crimea to fall under control of NATO. So here's a brief summary of this summary. The USA is shifting military emphasis from anti-terrorism to great power conflict, which is essentially the new Cold War with an arms race that we're running with Russia now. That's going to be a moneymaker. This new Cold War is being driven by fear of Russia, and arguably the greatest cause of this fear was Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, which was portrayed by U.S. politicians and the media as barbaric aggression. So the U.S. media and politicians have used this to paint a picture of Russia as a dangerous enemy and threat to European nations hell-bent on conquering West to rebuild its glorious empire. That is total bullshit. Russia's not trying to gain something. Russia's trying not to lose. And Russia is not expanding to the West. Russia is contracting, with NATO pushing in and encroaching at all points. I mean, look at, where is this? NATO has everything around Russia except for a tiny pocket here. 3 nations: Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo. All right? Serbia is more aligned with Russia. But Bosnia and Kosovo, well, you know, they're probably like Austria and Switzerland, where, hell, why should we bother joining? We're protected by NATO anyways. They're ringed by NATO, right? And then you got Finland and Sweden, but they are partnered with NATO, even though they're not officially members, all right? All right. So where was I? Okay. Russia wasn't trying to gain something with Crimea. They were trying not to lose all the military bases in Crimea. Russia wasn't initiating. Russia was reacting to a coup/revolution in Ukraine, through which a pro-Western government stole power and increased the risk of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, the media never tells you that, right? Why? Because they're not honest. They're biased as hell. If anything, the U.S. initiated by supporting the Euromaidan group, which stole power in a revolution, jamming Russia with increased threat of Ukraine joining NATO. And you know the U.S. has been pushing hard. They've been practicing with NATO going back to, man, it's been like 1994 when they've had Operation Sea Breeze with Ukraine, U.S. and Ukraine, right? They pushed hard in 2008, as you recall, to get Ukraine into NATO. They spent $5 billion trying to integrate Ukraine with the European Union and NATO. So this threat forced Putin to respond. And finally, Crimea rightfully belongs in Russia for all the following reasons: historical, military bases, ethnicity, political, linguistic, popular will of the people through referendums, and finally the illicit, unconstitutional means through which Crimea was transferred to Ukraine in the first place back in 1954. So this was not an aggressive Russian conquest of a completely foreign territory. It was a restoration of Crimea to where it rightfully belonged. And this was forced upon Russia by a revolution conducted by a U.S.-backed group that illegally stole power, increasing the risk of Ukraine joining NATO. I mean, it looks totally different when you reveal all the evidence, which is what politicians and the U.S. media don't do. They just make a scare picture. All right, that's it for that lecture. There's not too many left. I honestly think that I don't have much time. but I could be wrong.